So what we said last week was that we were going to finally sort of talk through what is it about language? What is it about the Bald Soprano? What is it about a lot of these absurdist plays that really allows us to dig into what it is that they sort of do and what it is that what makes them very interesting, what makes them special, right? And I mentioned that this is the play that sort of set me off on the journey through the absurd, and that as a language teacher, right, I especially find this to be interesting. I think Estlin talks a little bit about this, right? Estlin mentions in his analysis of Ionesco, a story that Ionesco, himself tells, and that is known, that Ionesco's first play, right, when he writes The Bald Soprano, he is thinking about it from basically the point of view of a person who's learning language. And that he gets this idea because he reads one of these language books, right? He's trying to learn a language, and he realizes that these language books contain conversations that are extraordinary, right? People who are living with each other, are telling each other facts about each other that any normal couple would know. That, people and friends are meeting always as if they're meeting for the very first time. They're telling each other things that don't make any sense for friends to tell each other, but treating it exactly in the way that you would, right? And that this is the way you kind of have to learn a language, right? When you're learning it for the first time. You learn how to say things that you will use when you're meeting people for the first time, but then really you would not need to use again, right? But that part of the learning of a language is practice, right? And you've got to practice in some way, and so learning certain things and saying certain things are going to be, saying certain things is going to be better, right, as far as learning a language than saying other things, right? So I think we start out right away in this play with this idea of the fact that this couple, right, the Smiths, are at home and are having this conversation eventually, right, after Mrs. Smith spends a good, 5 minutes of the beginning of the play saying things that are fairly remarkable when you consider that she's talking to no one or to her husband, right? Are we breaking the fourth wall? I don't know, probably not, but, they are talking with each other, and she just basically tells him the whole course of the evening, everything that they did, right? And there are some odd ways of talking about things. There are some odd things that she says. She clearly is, creating certain things that are very strange, but that you wouldn't normally do, right? You wouldn't normally sit around with your spouse or with your significant other or with your friends and say, here's everything we did tonight. Because you've been there. You know what everybody did, right? If you go out and you do something, you come back and somebody says, what did you do tonight? Then maybe you might, right, tell people what you did, but this is an unusual situation. And I think it highlights, one, the weirdness of language, right? That even language that makes sense doesn't work if it's out of context. But then later on, that there are things that you can say and directions you can go with a phrase or a sentence that, even though the words are in the correct order, the grammar may be correct, that when put side by side, when put in a certain order, when certain responses follow other, statements, that suddenly language falls apart, communication falls apart. And this fascinated me, right, as a student of literature, as a student of French, because this play was, of course, right, as most of these plays were, performed in French first. And it made me think about how difficult it must be to do things in a foreign language, right? And I know that sounds crazy to say because, right, I teach a foreign language, I speak a foreign language, I've done language learning for years, right? And so, you'd think I wouldn't be surprised by much when it comes to foreign language, but there are things that are very unusual in foreign language. For example, if you make mistakes in a language, and it's your native language, people will probably say, look, you made a mistake. This is your language. You need to say it this way, right? If you're taking English classes, right, then you're working on getting better at writing. And if you make mistakes, then somebody, your instructor is probably going to say, nope, you made a mistake here. Do this differently, spell this differently. You can't say this, right? It doesn't work that way. And in a foreign language, similar, right? You can't do this. You should do it differently. And here's how you correct it. So what happens when we try to write nonsense in a foreign language? Because in English, if I decide I'm going to write something that's nonsensical, and people know that I'm a native English speaker, but that I am writing something nonsensical, then there's a very different reaction than if somebody who does not know the language as a native language uses the language incorrectly. We assume that they're wrong, that they don't know what they're doing, and it's very difficult and sort of maybe upsetting for us to say, I'm sorry, you're trying to use the language poorly. You're trying to make jokes or trying to do something funny with the language. Can you do that, right? How do I know it's not because you don't know what you're doing, rather than you do know what you're doing, you're trying to do it wrong, right? In English, no problem, right? If I want to do something weird in a language, I've generally proposed my credentials. I'm a native speaker. I want to do something weird, right? Like we watched this play and we think, well, the translator took care of this, right? Put it into a format that makes sense. But again, even that, when we think about the translation of this particular play, there's a lot of nonsense in here. Is nonsense the same in every language? I started wondering that, and this is where we're going to go in the next video.